I'd been a ranger in Yellowstone for long enough to know the park like it was my own backyard, and I'd heard every story about odd lights and spirits in the woods. I didn't buy into it. Sure, I honored tradition, particularly given my Cherokee roots. Some sites, however, had reputations that even the most experienced rangers respected. The Silent Forest was one. It was tucked somewhere up north, and nobody ventured there alone. We used to joke that if you went in, you would never be the same again. But they weren't actually jokes. It was one of those stories that stuck with you, even if you weren't superstitious. One evening, I received a call concerning lights seen near the perimeter of that restricted area. There is no need for anyone to be there at that hour. I assumed it was only campers who were in inappropriate locations. I'd gone after a lot of them before. They had no idea how swiftly this area could turn on them if they weren't prepared. So I put on my gear and drove up, intending to pull them out, issue a ticket, and call it a night. I promised myself I would be back by daybreak. As I got closer, something seemed off. I found what looked like an old campsite. The fire was out but still warm, which didn't make sense because the items scattered around looked like they had been there forever. Rusty cans, worn-out clothing, things you'd expect to find in a junkyard, not a new campsite. An old backpack was pushed against a log, covered in dust and patched. Curious, I checked inside and discovered an ID. The name on it matched someone reported missing in the 1970s. I kept the ID and looked around for anything else. A faded camera was half buried in some leaves near a tree trunk. Even though the body was broken, the film remained inside. It felt like I had stepped into someone else's life, and everything around me had frozen in time. I had the feeling that someone had left everything behind in a hurry. The forest was still surrounding me, as if it were waiting. The longer I stood there, the more this doubt lingered in my mind. I knew I needed to get out, so I started back, but something felt different. I'd been in these woods long enough to recognize every twist and bend, yet the track was leading nowhere. I swear I was following my steps exactly, yet I kept winding up back at that blasted campsite. The frustration quickly gave way to another emotion. I took deep breaths and tried to focus. It seemed like I was being guided in circles. After an hour of wandering, I started hearing something, maybe footsteps. They weren't mine, though. They were heavier, spaced out, almost rhythmic. Every time I'd stop, they'd stop too. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe even a deer, but it sounded too calculated. As the minutes stretched on, the sound grew closer, lingering just out of sight, almost daring me to look. My flashlight was fading, so I pressed on, but as I moved, my legs felt heavier, dragging. When I looked down, my pants were torn and marked with thin lines, almost like cuts, and they stung something fierce. I hadn't tripped, hadn't fallen. I couldn't remember where these could have come from. My skin prickled, and it was then that I realized something in these woods didn't want me here. By the time I stumbled back to my truck, the sun was starting to rise. I was scratched up, dirty, and more than a little shaken. As I sat behind the wheel, I glanced at my arm and found faint markings, like roots had pressed into my skin. For a second, I thought I was seeing things. Maybe exhaustion, I figured, or maybe something else. When I finally got back to the station, the sun was already hanging low, stretching light across the forest. I'd only meant to be gone for a few hours, but somehow almost 2 days had slipped by. They thought I'd disappeared, and when I walked through that door, the other rangers stared at me like I was some kind of ghost. I guess I looked the part. Filthy, with scratches up and down my arms and legs. One of the guys, Jake, came over, took one look at me, and asked, "What the hell happened to you out there?" I tried to shrug it off, tried to explain it away with something simple, like I'd lost my bearings, but even I could hear the thinness of my words. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. They knew this place well enough to recognize when something wasn't right. There was this urge, though, to keep it to myself, like some instinct I didn't even understand. I was shaken in a way I hadn't felt before, and talking about it felt wrong. So I clammed up, just muttered something about getting back on track, and went to wash up. In the locker room, I leaned into the mirror, wiping away dirt and sweat, and spotted the marks on my arms. Thin, red welts curled up and down my skin in patterns that didn't make sense, like roots twisting beneath the surface. They'd fade in a few days, but that wasn't the part that stuck. I felt them there, like they were still crawling up my arms, and the sensation sent a shiver through me. It was then I noticed a slip of paper sticking out from my back pocket. I hadn't put it there. My hands shook as I pulled it out, feeling this strange weight settle over me. The paper was thin, nearly crumbling, yellowed with age. It was covered in a faded script in Cherokee, a language I could barely remember from childhood. I managed to make out a few words, but the meaning felt just out of reach, like a puzzle missing a piece. There was a date scrawled at the bottom, August 13th, 1975. The same date the missing hiker on the ID had vanished. I wanted to rip that paper up, throw it in the trash, but instead, I folded it carefully, tucking it back into my wallet. Something told me I'd need it again, as if it had a purpose I hadn't figured out yet. Back at my desk, I sat there staring at the wallet, the worn edges of the paper peeking out, while a thought nagged at me. Maybe the forest wasn't letting go just yet. The next few nights, I couldn't sleep. I'd close my eyes, only to see flashes of that campsite, the rusty cans, the strange footprints that seemed to appear around my own. Each detail pressed itself deeper into my mind, and I kept hearing those footsteps, that heavy, measured sound that had stalked me through the woods. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, reaching for a flashlight that wasn't there. One night, I heard something outside my window, just a quick, soft shuffle, like someone brushing past. I shot up, heart pounding, but when I peered out, nothing was there. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, some branch scraping the side of the building. But every time it happened, I felt that same prickling sensation, like I was back out there in the woods, something just out of sight, watching. A few weeks went by, and I started to wonder if I'd just imagined the whole thing. Exhaustion, nerves, whatever it was, maybe I was finally cracking under the strain. But then one morning, a hiker stumbled into the station, pale and shaken. He'd been camping near that same area, close to the silent forest, and he swore he'd heard someone moving around his tent all night. He'd called out, but no one answered. When he finally stepped outside, he'd found footprints, huge ones, far too large to belong to any of the animals around here. Listening to him talk, I felt that familiar chill settling in, the same one from that night. The forest had let me go, but it hadn't forgotten. As he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods wasn't just some ghost story. It was something much older, much more patient, something that could wait silently for as long as it took. Not long after the hiker's visit, I got back to my routine, but the strange events kept circling in my head. No matter what I did, thoughts of that campsite stayed with me, like a splinter just under the skin. It was early one morning, fog still settled over the park, when Jake walked in, holding that old ID card, the same one I'd found. He placed it on my desk without a word, just nodding toward it. The picture of the missing hiker looked faded, almost translucent, but the eyes in that photograph looked different. It felt ridiculous, but the way they stared back felt uncomfortably aware. Jake finally spoke up. "This guy," he said, tapping the ID, "was reported missing on August 13th, 1975, right?" I nodded, trying to sound nonchalant, but my chest tightened as he continued. "There was another one, years back, same date. No remains, no signs, just vanished into thin air. You remember the guy who walked in last week? Swears he saw footprints? Same spot." It hit me then. This wasn't just a one-time occurrence. "What are you getting at, Jake?" I asked, trying to shake off the unease spreading over me. He looked right at me, his face a mix of curiosity and concern. "Maybe it's nothing," he said, "but maybe we're missing something here. Maybe these dates aren't just coincidences." His words hung heavy in the air, the implication clear, even though neither of us wanted to say it out loud. The next few days, I spent all my free time looking up old case files, searching for anything that could tie together these strange disappearances. Each missing persons report felt like it had a shadow looming over it, the same vague sense of a trail gone cold too soon. No remains, no evidence, just people who walked into the park and didn't walk out. But each report came with the same note, August 13th. The deeper I went, the more I wondered if the silent forest was tied to something beyond what we understood. Then, one night, a call came in. A family of 4 had gotten lost in the same area. They'd gone camping and had somehow wandered off the marked trails. We'd dealt with lost tourists before, but there was something about this that set my nerves on edge. I suited up, grabbed my radio, and took off in the direction they'd last been spotted. The whole way, the stories I'd read replayed in my mind, each one amplifying the sense of urgency. When I got to the site, I called out, scanning the trees, waiting to hear something back. Nothing. Just that same strange stillness I'd felt before. I found their camp eventually, tents zipped up, backpacks scattered, food left out as if they'd vanished mid-meal. Everything felt wrong, down to the faint, almost stale scent hanging in the air. I pushed open one of the tents and found nothing but an open notebook, words scribbled in a frantic hand. Can't get out. Every path loops back. Something is out here. A chill gripped me. The family's tracks led off in every direction but always looped back to this one spot, like they'd been forced to return. It was unsettling, almost as if the forest had a mind of its own, steering them around, keeping them lost. I could feel my pulse racing, but I kept moving, calling out, hoping for any sign of life. After hours of searching, I found them huddled together, eyes wide, barely speaking. They looked at me like I'd materialized out of nowhere. "We couldn't find the way," the father stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every trail turned back on itself. We couldn't leave." His words confirmed what I'd been dreading, and as I led them back to the main path, I could feel something watching, waiting, just beyond the trees. Back at the station, they clung to each other, barely speaking, just grateful to be out. I watched them leave, but that look in their eyes, that wasn't just relief. It was like they'd seen something they couldn't quite grasp, something they didn't want to remember. And even though they were safe, I knew they'd never look at these woods the same way again. As I sat down at my desk, that faded slip of paper from the old ID came back to mind, that date scribbled across it, August 13th. It wasn't just a reminder, it felt like a warning, one that grew louder each time the date approached. That August, as the 13th crept closer, I found myself in a routine that felt anything but ordinary. Every night, I'd sit at my desk with that scrap of paper, running my fingers over the faded writing, tracing the edges of each line. It was strange, the way something so small could unsettle me so deeply. Part of me wanted to just throw it out, forget I'd ever seen it. But every time I tried, a part of me pulled back, like I was tethered to it. It was more than curiosity. It was like an unspoken warning. 2 days before the 13th, I was called out to a trail, close to where I'd found the campsite that started this whole mess. The call was simple enough. A couple hikers heard strange sounds and felt something off. They were already out of there, shaken but safe, and now it was just me, retracing their steps. As I reached that familiar clearing, the sky was dimming, painting everything in that eerie twilight, the kind that blurs lines between real and imagined. I knew what I was doing this time. I'd packed extra lights, a new radio, even a map I'd marked to avoid getting lost again. But none of it calmed my nerves. The campfire remains I'd seen last time were still there, cold as ever, and the backpack, though now covered with fresh leaves, looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Everything was frozen in time, as if waiting. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but something didn't sit right. As I turned to leave, a snap sounded from behind, like a branch breaking underfoot. I spun around, shining my flashlight, expecting to see... what exactly? Another hiker, maybe. A deer at worst. But there was nothing. Just shadows flickering in the edges of my light, the trees standing silent and still. I kept telling myself to move, to walk away. But I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. A voice crackled over my radio, making me jump. "Aiden, you copy?" It was Jake. I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I'm here. Just thought I heard something. Nothing to worry about." He paused, and I could almost feel his hesitation. "You all right, man? You sound different." His words hung there, unsettling. "Just tired," I replied, ending the call before he could press further. I took a final look around, forcing myself to leave. But as I started down the trail, I noticed a set of prints in the dirt. They were big, larger than any hiker's, but human-like. They'd been pressed into the earth with a weight that made each one sink deep, almost unnaturally so, and they weren't mine. Every step I took from that point on felt deliberate, like each one was pulling me deeper into something I couldn't control. The air felt denser, though I wouldn't call it heavy. It was more like the space around me had thickened, like a barrier was forming between me and everything else. I took another step, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them rational, all of them creeping into my bones. I could barely make out the path ahead, the twilight now fading fast. I switched on my extra flashlight, scanning the area as I walked. Another snap echoed, this time louder. I swung my light around, catching a glimpse of something moving between the trees, just a shadow, but enough to freeze me in place. I strained to make out a shape, a face, anything, but it was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Turning back wasn't an option. I couldn't let myself panic, not here, not now. Instead, I forced myself forward, ignoring the growing thud of my heartbeat in my chest. It was just a few more steps to the exit, or so I thought. But as I walked, the landscape twisted, almost imperceptibly at first, until I realized the trail had shifted, leading me back toward the clearing. I realized too late that the path had betrayed me. It was like walking through a maze that kept rearranging itself, looping back to the clearing, dragging me deeper each time. I forced myself to focus, steadying my breaths, counting steps, marking each tree with my flashlight. But no matter what I did, the same burned-out campsite reappeared before me, the empty tent flapping in the faint breeze, that ancient, broken camera half buried in the dirt. I could almost hear the click of its shutter, capturing nothing but endless, silent darkness. Then I saw them, the footprints. The same massive prints, trailing off into the dense trees. They looked recent, the weight of each step pressed firmly into the soil, guiding me somewhere I didn't want to go. I told myself to turn around, but my legs carried me forward, like I was following a command I couldn't hear but felt deep in my bones. It was like being pulled by a current, helpless to resist, every instinct screaming, and yet I moved, step by step. Somewhere behind me, I heard my own voice on the radio. "Aiden? You copy?" It was my voice, but I hadn't spoken a word. The sound crackled, fading in and out, repeating the same line. "Aiden, do you copy?" I reached for my radio, but it was off, the light dead. But the voice didn't stop. It just kept going, over and over, like a taunt. Something was mimicking me, trying to pull me in further. And God help me, it was working. I felt my heart pounding as I stumbled forward, now half running, breaking through branches that clawed at my clothes. I was desperate to break free, find some way out. But as I crashed through the underbrush, I tripped, falling hard onto my hands and knees. Right in front of me lay a familiar object, a wallet, half buried in leaves. When I pulled it free, I recognized it instantly. It was mine, the leather scratched, my ID staring back up at me, but weathered, as if it had been left here for years. The realization struck, and dread settled in. I wasn't the first. Whoever, or whatever, had left those prints had been guiding me from the start, drawing me in circles, pushing me toward this very spot. My flashlight flickered, and I felt a presence closing in. Shadows thickened, surrounding me, and I could swear I saw shapes moving just beyond my line of sight, closing in from all directions. They were waiting, patient and quiet, watching me. I forced myself up, stumbling back toward what I hoped was the path out. The forest twisted around me, my own tracks vanishing behind me as if they'd been erased. It was like the forest was alive, hiding any way to escape, trapping me in a place where time meant nothing. I felt each step way heavier, like I was sinking, but I pushed on, willing myself not to stop, not to give in. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a break in the trees, the dim light of dawn reaching through. I stumbled forward, heart pounding, not daring to look back. The trees seemed to release me, letting me slip out of their grasp, as if they'd decided at the last second to let me go. The relief was overwhelming, and I didn't stop until I was back at the station, breathless, clutching my wallet like it was a lifeline. I never spoke of what happened that night. I told the others I'd gotten lost, laughed it off, kept the real story buried. But every year, as August 13 rolls around, I feel it calling me back, a quiet pull that whispers to me from the shadows. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I hear my own voice, crackling over the radio, echoing from somewhere deep within that forest, waiting for me to answer. I've worked in the Great Smoky Mountains for years, long enough to know when a story has something unusual behind it. On August 5, 1989, I was out on routine patrol, just checking some trails and making sure everything was running as it should. That's when Dennis Ortega, a tourist from a group that had been hiking all day, approached me with this look, one I'd seen before on folks who'd wandered too far or stumbled onto something they couldn't quite wrap their heads around. Dennis was pale, shaky even. He claimed he'd seen something massive, strange, unlike any animal he'd ever laid eyes on. He wasn't the kind of guy to tell tall tales. His face said it all. Now, people often come up with all kinds of stories about these woods, especially when they get a little lost or let their imaginations run wild after sunset. But Dennis seemed different. He said he'd spotted it from a distance, a towering figure, moving slowly but with a purpose, just beyond a ridge. He said it didn't look like any bear or mountain lion. He stammered out a description, words spilling over each other, tall, almost human-like, but with features too distorted, too wild to be one of us. It was enough to spark a feeling I couldn't quite shake, and I'd learned long ago that when you feel that way, it's best to pay attention. I decided to take a closer look. Making my way along the trail he'd described, I scanned the surroundings, watching for any sign of movement. The trees felt unusually still, almost expectant, like they were holding their breath. As I moved deeper in, I noticed something odd, a scattering of broken branches and large footprints in the mud. They were too big to belong to any known animal around here. That was enough to keep me moving forward, my senses tuned sharper than ever. It didn't take long before I caught sight of it. There, just beyond the next bend, it was standing partially hidden among the trees. A creature unlike anything I'd seen, human but not. I couldn't make out every detail, but it was tall, with broad shoulders and a posture that made me feel like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. There was something ancient about it, like it didn't belong in any timeline I knew. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my mind clear. I'd heard stories from my Cherokee relatives about the spirits of the land, protectors and watchers, but this felt different. I reached for my radio, quietly calling for backup, careful not to make any sudden moves. But then, in a split second, it shifted, moving out of the shadows, as if deciding whether to come closer. I held my ground, not daring to move or even breathe too loudly. It felt like a test, a standoff between me and something I couldn't fully understand. I couldn't tell if it was curious or if it saw me as a threat, but I wasn't about to find out by making the wrong move. Suddenly, a voice called out nearby, startling both of us. "Help!" It was a man's voice, faint but desperate, echoing from just a bit deeper in the woods. For a moment, I thought the creature would vanish, retreating like some apparition, but it stayed, its gaze following the sound too. I took that split second to move, carefully but quickly heading toward the voice. As I got closer, I found him, Mark Thompson, injured and leaning against a tree, blood trickling from a gash on his arm. He looked as shaken as Dennis had, if not more, his eyes wide with a kind of terror that wasn't going away anytime soon. Mark told me he'd been hiking off trail when he saw it, felt it following him, watching him. He'd stumbled, and as he tried to get up, the creature had appeared, its outline dark against the last light of day. He hadn't had time to process it, only time to run. I helped him up, steadying him as we started back toward the main trail. But I knew we weren't alone. Every step felt heavy, every sound amplified, like the forest itself was on edge. Then, just as we rounded a curve, there it was again. This time it was closer. I felt the tension in Mark's grip tighten, his panic rising. Without thinking, I flicked on my flashlight, hoping it'd be enough to keep it at bay. I aimed the beam straight at it, and for a moment it seemed to hesitate, its form half hidden, half revealed in the light. I didn't dare look away, didn't dare lower the light, feeling the weight of its gaze on me. Finally, in the distance, I could hear my team, their voices breaking the silence, coming closer with the distinct clink of their gear. The creature turned slowly, almost reluctantly, and then with a low, guttural sound, it melted back into the forest. We didn't speak for a long time after that. Mark was still too rattled, and I had no words that could possibly explain what we'd just seen. Back at the station, I kept things to myself, filing the report under animal encounter and leaving out the details that wouldn't sit well with anyone not there. As I drove down that narrow road, The weight of my unease grew heavier. The trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out, almost as if they were trying to grasp my truck and pull me back. The dim glow of my headlights barely cut through the thick fog that clung to the asphalt, shrouding everything in a disorienting gray haze. My mind wandered back to the radio chatter I'd heard before, cryptic messages that haunted my thoughts. What kind of person would broadcast a plea for help in the middle of nowhere? I clenched the steering wheel, willing myself to focus. This is just another night on the road, I reminded myself. My instincts had kept me safe for years, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. It was like a shadow, always there, lurking just out of sight. I could almost hear the faint crackle of the radio calling me again, as if the voice had seeped into the fog itself. "Help me," it seemed to say, echoing in my ears. The landscape morphed around me as the minutes dragged on. I passed the remnants of an old gas station, rusted pumps, cracked glass. Who would have thought there'd be nothing out here? I wondered. It felt like I was slipping into another world, one untouched by time. I turned the dial on my radio, searching for some kind of distraction. Static, then a song I'd never heard, followed by the voice again, more urgent this time. It felt impossibly close, as if it were right next to me, whispering secrets in the dark. "Why am I even here?" I muttered, the question hanging in the air. The highway stretched on endlessly, taunting me with its isolation. It made me think about other truckers who had taken this route. Some told stories of strange happenings, of getting lost for hours only to emerge where they'd started. Had they encountered this voice? Did they dismiss it like I was trying to? Suddenly, I spotted something unusual off to the side of the road. A glint of metal? I slowed down, my heart racing. I could see what looked like an abandoned vehicle, half hidden by trees. Could it be? My instincts screamed at me to turn around, yet I felt compelled to investigate. As I stepped out of my truck, the cold night air wrapped around me. The world felt oddly quiet, too quiet, and I felt a shiver creep up my spine. Walking toward the vehicle, I noticed the rust and dirt caking its surfaces. No recent tire marks. What could have happened here? The hairs on my arms stood on end. I leaned closer to inspect the windows, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. I didn't want to admit it, but there was something deeply unsettling about this place. Was that a seatbelt still buckled inside? A chill surged through me as I glanced at my phone. No signal. Great. Alone in the dark, with only the whispers of the wind for company. I started to back away, my instincts flaring. Just then, the radio crackled to life again. The voice, so close. "Help, I'm trapped." My breath hitched in my throat. I whipped around, half expecting someone to leap out from behind the trees. "Is anyone out there?" I shouted into the night. The only response was the rustle of leaves, mocking my vulnerability. That's when I noticed something else, a fresh set of footprints leading away from the truck. Where did they come from? My heart raced as I took a step back, each heartbeat echoing in my ears. The voice lingered, the plea for help intertwining with my rising dread. I had to make a choice, stay and uncover the mystery or retreat to the safety of my truck. I hesitated, the conflicting emotions tearing at me. What if this was a trap? But what if someone truly needed help? As I turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A shadow slipped between the trees. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and an overwhelming sense of danger washed over me. There was no turning back now. As I stood there, frozen in place, the shadows danced around me, twisting and turning like whispers of a nightmare. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my own fear. What was I doing here? My instincts urged me to turn back, yet something pulled me toward those footprints. Curiosity, or was it desperation? I had to know what lay ahead. The darkness shifted again, revealing a figure just beyond the tree line. It was just a blur, an outline of a person who seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering slightly. My heart raced, but there was something familiar about the silhouette, something that made me feel strangely connected. "Are you hurt?" As I stepped forward, the figure disappeared, but the echo of that voice lingered in the air. "Help me." It was a soft plea that clawed at my chest, igniting a spark of urgency. Could it be a trick of the mind? My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, swinging it around, searching for any sign of life. Each flicker of light felt like a chance. an opportunity to uncover the truth or face a terrifying illusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The more I scanned the area, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just a game of shadows. I recalled stories from fellow truckers about encounters with strangers on deserted roads. Some spoke of kindness, others of danger. But how do you know who to trust in the dark? I had always prided myself on being street smart, but this was different. This felt primal. Just then, a rustling noise caught my attention. I turned abruptly, the beam of my flashlight illuminating a pair of eyes staring back at me from the underbrush. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice steadying. The eyes blinked, and in that instant, a feeling of recognition washed over me. I knew this person. As the figure stepped into the light, I realized it was a young woman, disheveled and pale, with dirt smudged across her cheeks. "Please, you have to help me," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "I've been trapped here." My mind raced. How had she gotten here? What did she mean by trapped? "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. But my heart was pounding, urging me to be cautious. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression wild, as if she feared something lurking in the darkness. "I don't know," she whispered. "I was driving and I got lost. I saw something, and then I couldn't find my way back." A chill ran down my spine. "Something?" I pressed, leaning in. "What did you see?" She hesitated, biting her lip, a flicker of fear crossing her features. "I don't know if you'll believe me, but it was a truck, an old one. It looked like it was from another time." My thoughts spun. This was starting to sound too familiar. "I think I know the one you're talking about," I said slowly, my mind racing back to the voice on the radio and the vehicle I had found. "You were hearing that voice too, weren't you?" Her eyes widened, and she nodded fervently. "Yes, it kept calling for help, and then it just vanished." In that moment, reality blurred with fear. The pieces were fitting together, and yet I was no closer to understanding. I could feel the ground shifting beneath me as uncertainty clawed at my gut. What had we stumbled into? And more importantly, how would we escape? I glanced back at the road, the darkness looming larger. No turning back now. As we stood there, an uneasy silence enveloped us, thickening the air. I glanced at the woman beside me, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of my flashlight. "What's your name?" I asked, needing to break the tension. "Lily," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you?" I introduced myself, feeling a strange bond forming between us. We were two lost souls, navigating a nightmare that neither of us had expected. "We need to find a way out of here," I said, shifting my focus to the path ahead. The road stretched out like a dark ribbon, coiling into the unknown. "Can you remember anything from earlier? Maybe something that can guide us?" Lily looked down, brow furrowed as she tried to recall. I remember headlights, a truck coming towards me, then everything went black." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "A truck? Like the one you saw earlier?" She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. It felt wrong, like it was a part of something sinister. "And you heard a voice?" I probed further. "Yes, it was pleading, begging for help." I swallowed hard, recalling my own encounter with that eerie call on the radio. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind us, jolting me into action. "Run!" I shouted, and we took off down the road, adrenaline pumping through our veins. As we sprinted, I could hear Lily's footsteps pounding against the asphalt, matching my frantic rhythm. What was chasing us? I didn't dare look back, fearing the sight of whatever horror lurked behind. After what felt like an eternity, we slowed down, both gasping for breath. I leaned against a rusted signpost, the name worn away by time. "We need a plan," I said, panting. "Let's find a place to hide and think." Lily nodded, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "There's an old gas station a few miles back. We could check it out." It was a risk, but it felt like our only option. As we walked, the landscape shifted subtly. The trees leaned closer, their branches like fingers reaching out, almost as if they were trying to pull us back. "Why did we come this way?" I muttered under my breath, frustration boiling within me. It felt like we were trapped in a loop, each step leading us deeper into a nightmare with no exit. "We didn't have a choice," Lily replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. "Sometimes we find ourselves in places we didn't expect, right?" Her words struck a chord. It reminded me of the countless times I had driven through dark roads, thinking I knew them, only to discover hidden dangers lurking just out of sight. As we approached the gas station, it loomed ahead like a ghost from the past. The building was dilapidated, windows boarded up, yet the front door creaked open as if inviting us inside. "You ready?" I asked, anxiety crawling under my skin. Lily took a deep breath, then nodded. "Together, right?" "Together," I affirmed. We stepped through the threshold, the air thick with dust and memories. The interior was dim, littered with remnants of a forgotten era, old magazines, a faded calendar from 1997. I felt an unsettling familiarity. "Do you think anyone's been here?" I asked, scanning the room. "I don't know, but I hope we're alone," Lily said, her voice trembling slightly. Just as the words left her lips, we heard a sound, a low growl resonating from the back room. My heart dropped. "We need to hide. Now." I pulled her behind the counter, where the shadows enveloped us. We could hear the footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. Whatever was in this place with us, it was hunting. As we crouched behind the counter, I strained to hear the footsteps drawing closer. They were methodical, like a predator stalking its prey. I whispered to Lily, "What do we do if it finds us?" My heart raced as I thought of the stories I'd heard about people who vanished in places like this, people who were never seen again. "We can't let it catch us," she replied, her eyes wide with terror. I could see her mind racing, grappling with the same dread that was twisting inside me. "If we're quiet, maybe it'll pass," I suggested, hoping it was true. The sound of heavy breathing echoed through the gas station, amplifying our fear. The air felt thick, pressing down on us, as if the building itself was alive, holding its breath. I could see dust particles dancing in the faint light filtering through the cracks. It reminded me of those moments in life when everything feels still, just before a storm breaks loose, full of anticipation and dread. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. "Do you think it's gone?" I dared to ask, barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Lily replied, her voice trembling. We exchanged glances, our unspoken fears bridging the gap between us. My mind raced through the worst possibilities. What if this was the end? The thought was paralyzing. "We have to move," I finally said, finding the courage to break the stalemate. We waited a moment longer, listening intently. When the silence lingered, I slowly inched forward, trying to peer around the edge of the counter. I didn't see anything, but that didn't ease my tension. I could still feel something lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Let's check the back," I whispered, feeling a surge of adrenaline. "If we're going to escape, we need to know what we're up against." Lily nodded, her determination shining through her fear. As we crept toward the back room, I noticed the walls were lined with faded photographs, old gas station patrons, their faces frozen in time. They looked happy, unaware of the darkness that would soon consume this place. A chill ran down my spine. "It's like they knew something we don't," I muttered. The door to the back room creaked open, revealing a dimly lit space filled with cobwebs and old equipment. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the beam revealing more remnants of the past. I could feel my pulse quickening. "This place feels like it's been forgotten," Lily said softly, almost to herself. "Or worse, it's waiting." The way she said it sent a jolt through me. Then, just as I was about to investigate further, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. I turned quickly, my heart racing. "Did you see that?" I asked, breathless. Lily nodded slowly, her expression shifting from fear to confusion. "What was it?" She stepped closer, her curiosity piqued despite the terror enveloping us. As I prepared to leave the back room, I noticed an old newspaper clipping pinned to the wall. It was dated years ago, detailing strange disappearances around this very gas station. "No way," I whispered, my skin prickling as I read about people who had come here seeking refuge, only to vanish without a trace. "We're not alone here, are we?" My voice quivered as I shared my discovery. Lily's face paled as she read over my shoulder. Before we could react, a loud crash echoed from the front of the station, shattering our moment of clarity. I felt my blood run cold. "We have to go now!" I shouted, pulling Lily by the arm. We bolted back to the front, our hearts pounding as we skidded to a halt. Just beyond the door, a shadow loomed, blocking our escape. "I told you to stay away," a voice boomed, sending a chill down my spine. It was the voice we had heard earlier, distorted and laced with fury. My mind raced with panic. "We don't want any trouble," I shouted back, but deep down I knew it wouldn't listen. "Just let us go." But it didn't move. Instead, it stepped into the light, revealing a figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes glinting like shards of glass. My heart sank as reality hit me. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was a nightmare rooted in the very fabric of this place. "What do you want from us?" I yelled, feeling the weight of dread pressing down on my chest. "You've come to my domain," it hissed, each word dripping with malice. "And now you must pay the price." It was then I understood. The gas station wasn't merely a building. It was a trap, a dark entity thriving on fear and desperation. "We need to find a way out, fast," I whispered to Lily, panic surging through me as I backed away slowly. This was more than just survival. It was a battle against an ancient evil that thrived in the shadows. As we turned to run, the figure laughed, a sound that would haunt me forever. "You can't escape what's already chosen you." And just like that, the darkness enveloped us, closing in, leaving only the echo of our frantic footsteps behind. I was just wrapping up my usual morning at the station in Rosewood, Maine. The town had a certain charm, a comforting predictability in its rhythm. People knew each other, exchanged pleasantries at the cafe, and life seemed to move at an easy pace. I'd spent years here, navigating the occasional domestic dispute or petty theft, but nothing that ever truly shook me. I thought I had seen it all until that fateful call. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, slicing through the monotony. "Kevin, we've got a report of a possible body at the old Hayes place." A chill ran down my spine. The Hayes house was an ancient Victorian, long abandoned and cloaked in local legends. No one dared to go near it anymore. "Copy that," I replied, my mind racing as I grabbed my coat. A body? In Rosewood? This was not a typical Tuesday. As I drove down the winding roads leading to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping in. The sky hung heavy with clouds, dimming the late morning light. I pulled into the overgrown driveway, the crunch of gravel beneath my tires echoing like an unwanted visitor. The Victorian loomed ahead, its once proud facade now crumbling, draped in shadows and silence. This wasn't just any crime scene. It was a relic of a time when Rosewood was alive with laughter and community. Stepping out of my car, the chill in the air wrapped around me like a shroud. I approached the entrance, every instinct telling me to turn back. The door creaked open, revealing a musty interior. Dust motes danced in the dim light, and my footsteps stirred up memories trapped in the stillness. As I made my way through the house, I felt as if I were intruding on something sacred, an untouched moment frozen in time. Then I saw him. Thomas Hayes lay sprawled on the floor, his eyes wide open in an expression of terror that felt almost unnatural. The room felt alive with tension, a stark contrast to the decay surrounding it. I knelt beside him, noting the bruises and cuts that marred his skin. "What happened to you, Thomas?" I whispered, more to myself than to the lifeless body. The sight was surreal, like a scene from a horror movie. Yet, this was my reality, and it was terrifying. As I stood, my mind buzzed with questions. Who would want to hurt Thomas? He was known around town as a decent mechanic. Nothing more, nothing less. I stepped outside, seeking clarity in the light of day. That's when I spotted Martha Kruger across the street, her eyes wide and anxious. She was the kind of woman who had lived in Rosewood forever, always keeping tabs on the neighborhood. "Martha," I called, motioning her over. She approached hesitantly, glancing back at the house. "Did you see anything unusual last night?" I asked, searching her face for answers. I thought I saw something," she stammered, her voice trembling. "A creature, something strange lurking near the trees." I raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. What kind of creature could frighten Martha? In all my years, I had never heard her speak of anything that could rattle her. With her description ringing in my ears, I turned my attention back to the house. Inside, I discovered Thomas's diary tucked away in a drawer. Flipping through the pages, I felt a growing unease. His words painted a chilling picture of fear. He spoke of being watched, of a presence that haunted him. The more I read, the more I realized that whatever he had encountered, it had left him terrified to his core. That evening, after piecing together the fragments of the day, I felt compelled to explore the nearby woods. Maybe the answers lay beyond the confines of the Victorian walls. With the diary in hand, I stepped into the forest, not knowing that I was about to cross into a realm I could never have anticipated. As I walked, shadows danced around me, and the trees seemed to whisper secrets from long ago. Little did I know, the true horror of Rosewood was only just beginning to unfold. I stepped into the woods, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels, each branch seeming to stretch toward me. My heart raced, echoing the pulse of the earth beneath my feet. As I moved deeper, I recalled stories from my childhood, tales of lost hikers and unexplained disappearances. Everyone had a theory, but no one dared to venture too far. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to uncover its secrets. Then a rustle caught my attention. I paused, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. "Is anyone there?" I called, my voice breaking the stillness. The only response was the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I shook off the unease and continued onward, clutching Thomas's diary, its pages filled with his fears. Each word seemed to vibrate in the air, pulling me closer to the truth he had uncovered. I wandered further until I stumbled upon a clearing, bathed in the fading light of dusk. A strange marking on the ground drew my gaze, a circle of stones arranged meticulously, each one etched with symbols I didn't recognize. My instincts screamed to leave, but curiosity rooted me in place. As I knelt to examine the stones, I recalled Martha's words. A creature. What kind of being would leave markings like these? It was then that I felt it, a tingling sensation creeping up my spine. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, barely audible, drifting through the trees. "Help me." The voice was soft, almost pleading. I glanced around, heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No one answered. I stood up, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something drew me to the edge of the clearing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I turned to leave, but just then, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man, his face gaunt and pale, eyes wide with fear. "Please," he gasped, stumbling toward me. "You have to help me." I recognized him from town, Daniel, a quiet man who had lived on the outskirts for years. "What happened?" I asked, my heart racing as he took a shaky breath. "I've been hiding," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Something's out there. It's not human." His words sent a shiver through me. "What do you mean?" I pressed, sensing the urgency in his tone. "I saw it in the woods. It's watching, always watching." He looked around as if expecting the creature to appear at any moment. "We can't stay here. It knows we're here." Before I could respond, he grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the tree line. "We need to go, now." I felt torn. Should I trust him? But the desperation in his eyes was undeniable. We sprinted through the underbrush, branches snapping underfoot as we dodged between trees. As we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind us, lurking just out of sight. "Why were you out here?" I gasped as we reached the edge of the woods. "I was looking for my dog," he admitted, breathless. "He ran off last night. That's when I saw it." My mind raced. A dog? Was that what had drawn him into the forest? "What did it look like?" I asked, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaking. "It was dark, just a shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me." Just then, a noise erupted from behind us, a rustling that sent a jolt of fear through my veins. We stopped, turning to face the sound, but nothing emerged. "We have to keep moving," I urged, dragging him forward. "We can't let it catch us." The fear was palpable, an invisible weight pressing down on us. As we reached the main road, I glanced back, half expecting to see something chasing us. But all I found was the eerie stillness of the trees. We collapsed on the roadside, gasping for breath. "What do we do now?" I asked, my mind spinning. "I don't know," Daniel replied, trembling. "But we have to warn the others." I nodded, but deep down, dread twisted in my gut. Would anyone believe us? Would they even care? The sun dipped below the horizon, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. We had escaped for now, but the knowledge that something was out there, something sinister, hung in the air. "Let's get to town," I urged, standing and pulling him up. As we began to walk, I felt a cold gust of wind brush past, carrying with it a whisper that sent chills down my spine. It was a warning, I realized, a promise that the darkness would not rest until it had claimed what it wanted. And in that moment, I understood that whatever was haunting Rosewood was far from over. The true terror lay not just in what we had encountered, but in the secrets the town held, waiting to be uncovered. Little did we know, this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would grip us all. It's been a week since the incident in the clearing, but every night I find myself drawn back to that moment. Sitting on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I can't shake the feeling that the woods are watching me. I often wonder if there's more to that place than just trees and dirt. Maybe it's a gateway, not just to the past, but to something lurking beneath the surface. Sometimes I hear the wind whisper through the leaves, and I can't help but listen closely, hoping to decode a message. My coworkers say I should let it go, but how could I? That cabin, once a mere dot in my memory, now haunts my thoughts. I can picture it, the peeling paint, the overgrown weeds, and that unsettling light. It was like the forest had put on a show, designed to draw me in. Even now, I can feel the unease creeping back in as I think about the times I went camping as a kid, the thrill of the outdoors mixed with the faint fear of what might be lurking in the shadows. That cabin wasn't just a building, it was a puzzle, and I'm desperate to solve it. I remember discussing it with Matt, one of the newer rangers. "You're telling me you actually found a cabin that shouldn't even exist," he said, his brow furrowing in disbelief. I couldn't blame him. Who would take a tall tale seriously? But as I recounted my experience, I saw a flicker of concern cross his face. "You should talk to Sarah about this. She knows about the old legends," he suggested, clearly unsure if I was joking or not. The legends. It felt like opening a Pandora's box, one I wasn't ready to dive into. So, I went to see Sarah the next day. She's been working in these woods longer than anyone, and when I mentioned the cabin, her expression shifted. "You're not the first ranger to see it," she said, her voice steady but laced with something unspoken. "They say it appears when the moon is full and vanishes with the dawn." I could feel my heart race. Had I stepped into some twisted folklore? She went on, describing how past rangers had encountered odd occurrences, flickering lights, eerie sounds, and the feeling of being followed. "It's a place where time blurs," she added, almost as if she were warning me. That night, I lay awake, replaying her words. Time blurs. What did that mean? Was it possible that I had slipped into another realm without realizing it? I thought of the clock in my truck, the way it seemed to flicker and skip when I was near the clearing. I started mapping out all the strange events I'd ignored over the years. A flash of headlights in the distance that disappeared when I went to investigate, the sensation of cold air wrapping around me, even in the heat of summer. Had I been missing signs all along? In my restless nights, I began digging into local history. I combed through archives, looking for clues about the land. There were whispers of sacrifices made by indigenous tribes, old tales of lost souls wandering between worlds. It sent chills down my spine, but it also lit a fire in me. I needed answers, not just for my sake, but for everyone who had stepped into that strange light before me. I even contacted a historian who specialized in local legends, eager to learn if there was a connection. Days turned into sleepless nights, and I began jotting down my findings in a journal. This can't just be a coincidence, I thought, writing fervently, connecting dots no one else seemed to see. But the more I uncovered, the more questions arose. I found myself pacing late at night, wondering how many others might have experienced something similar. And just as I thought I was close to an answer, I received a call that turned my world upside down. A fellow ranger had gone missing in the same area. The unease transformed into dread. I hurried to the site where he disappeared, determined to find out what was happening. But the moment I stepped into the clearing, the weight of the woods pressed down on me. The trees stood silent, as if they were waiting for something. I could hear my own breath, louder than ever, as I called out his name, hoping for a response. "Ben!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the stillness. No answer. Just the rustling leaves, now eerily familiar, a reminder of that night I stumbled upon the cabin. As I searched, memories flooded my mind. The stories Sarah shared, the legends of lost souls. Was it too late for my colleague? Or had he stumbled into a world where time had no meaning, just as I had? Each rustle of the branches felt like an echo of those who had come before, each footstep resonating with their experiences. The boundary between the real and the unknown began to blur, and I felt the ground shift beneath me, a reminder that I was not just a spectator in this tale. I was a player in a game much larger than myself, and I had to find the truth before it swallowed me whole. And then I saw it again, the outline of the cabin, flickering as if it were alive. My heart raced, but there was no turning back now. I stepped forward, compelled by a force I could hardly understand. The door creaked open, revealing the familiar yet otherworldly interior. I could feel the air thick with anticipation, each shadow whispering secrets. I took a breath, stepping into the unknown, ready to confront whatever lay ahead, knowing I was on the brink of something far beyond my understanding. As I sat in my truck, staring out at the horizon, a heavy sense of dread settled over me. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the highway. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the eerie silence, it was as if the world had slipped into an uncanny stillness. I remembered the stories I'd heard from other truckers about strange occurrences on lonely roads, figures appearing out of nowhere, shadows moving in the rearview mirror, voices crackling through the radio. I never took those tales seriously, but now I found myself questioning everything. Suddenly, a flicker caught my attention. I turned my head, half expecting to see a stray animal crossing the road. Instead, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees. It looked almost like a woman, her white dress billowing in the wind, yet she stood completely still, as if frozen in time. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things, but there she was, unwavering and eerily serene. A chill ran through me. Just a mirage, I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. In an attempt to shake off the unease, I turned on the radio, hoping for the familiar voice of a DJ to drown out my thoughts. Instead, I heard static, just a buzzing noise that filled the cab like an unwelcome guest. I fiddled with the knobs, trying to find a clear channel, but the interference persisted. It felt as though the very air around me was charged with a strange energy, almost as if the universe was trying to send me a warning. "Get out of here," it seemed to whisper, though I couldn't quite place where that thought had come from. I took a deep breath, convincing myself I needed to focus on the road. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the woman. She was still there, now looking directly at me. I could see her features more clearly, sunken cheeks, hollow eyes. I could almost feel her gaze piercing through me, as if she were searching for something. My heart raced. "This is ridiculous," I told myself, shaking my head. Yet, my grip on the steering wheel tightened. I didn't dare look back again. Moments turned into hours as I navigated the winding road. My mind drifted to my family. I thought about my daughter, how she would react if I didn't come home. Would she worry? Would she feel the same kind of dread I was feeling now? It was the thought of her that kept me grounded. I needed to make it home, no matter what. Just as I settled into that thought, the radio crackled back to life, a voice breaking through the static. "Help! Trapped! Please!" It was faint, barely audible, yet my heart dropped. Who was that? Was someone in distress? I tried to pinpoint the source, my heart pounding. "This can't be real," I whispered. As I drove, the voice grew clearer, the desperation palpable. "Help me, I'm lost." Panic gripped me. I glanced around, half expecting to see a wrecked vehicle off the side of the road, but the darkness offered no clues. Stay calm, I repeated under my breath, forcing myself to focus. Yet the voice continued, calling out for help, twisting my gut with its urgency. A part of me wanted to ignore it and keep driving, but something deeper compelled me to respond. I pulled over at the next clearing, heart racing, trying to catch my breath. "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small against the vastness of the night. No response, just the rustle of leaves in the distance. I strained my ears, hoping to hear something, anything. It felt as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. As I sat there, staring into the darkness, the radio crackled again. "I'm here. Please help." The voice sounded so close, yet I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. I glanced around, every shadow now seeming to loom larger than before. My mind raced back to the figure I had seen earlier. What if these were all connected? What if she was somehow involved in this? The thought twisted in my mind like a thorn, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Desperate to break free from the growing paranoia, I turned off the radio and gripped the wheel tightly. Just drive, I told myself. But as I pulled back onto the highway, I felt a sinking sensation. What if I was leaving someone behind? What if this was a trap? The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. And just like that, I found myself in a nightmare I couldn't escape, a choice looming before me: continue driving or turn back into the darkness, unsure of what awaited. With every mile I drove, the fear gnawed at me. Was I abandoning a soul in need, or was I just escaping a horror I couldn't comprehend? The lines between reality and madness blurred as I pressed on, every shadow on the road becoming a potential harbinger of what was to come. You think you know your limits until something throws you completely off course. For me, it was a simple decision to take a detour on my way back from a long haul. I was tired, desperate to get home, and saw a shortcut that looked harmless enough. But I was wrong. As I took that winding road through the mountains, I felt a chill in the air, a creeping sensation that something wasn't right. The GPS was useless out there, just spinning in circles as if mocking my foolishness. It wasn't long before the road became less traveled, the trees closing in on me, creating a canopy that blocked out the fading light. Hours dragged on. I felt like I was driving in circles, the same patches of road repeating before my eyes. Just as I was about to pull over and call it quits, my radio crackled to life. "Help me. I'm stuck." The voice came through clear, urgent, and trembling. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. It was way past midnight. I thought about ignoring it, but the weight of that voice pulled at me like a heavy anchor. What if someone truly needed help? A flicker of instinct nudged me to investigate. After all, who wouldn't want to be the hero in someone's story? I turned the truck around and followed the sound, my gut twisting with every mile. With the headlights illuminating the dark, I felt as if I was stepping into another world. Suddenly, I spotted something in the distance. There it was, a truck on the side of the road, partially hidden among the trees. I pulled over and jumped out, the gravel crunching underfoot, echoing in the stillness. The air felt electric, charged with an unease I couldn't shake. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice sounding small against the vastness of the night. But the only reply was the rustling of leaves. I approached the abandoned truck, noticing how it sat there, almost forgotten, as if time had stalled around it. The door was ajar, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Peeking inside, I found the driver's seat covered in dust, a faded baseball cap resting on the dash. Where was the owner? The radio crackled again, but this time it was different. "Help me." It sounded closer, more desperate, like it was coming from inside my own head. Every instinct screamed for me to get back in my truck and leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of life, any hint of what had happened. That's when I noticed the footprints leading away from the truck, small and faded, like a ghost had walked past. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitantly followed them, the dark swallowing me whole with every step I took. Suddenly, I stumbled upon an old cabin, hidden behind thick brush, its silhouette jagged against the moonlight. It felt wrong, out of place. Maybe someone's in there, I thought. I stepped closer, the creaking of the old wood echoing in the silence. I hesitated at the door, heart racing, when I heard a faint whimper from within. My stomach twisted. Should I really be doing this? Yet that voice from the radio lingered in my mind. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, the floor covered in dust. I called out again, "Is anyone here?" A chill ran down my spine as I walked further inside. The furniture was dilapidated, but there were signs of life, half-eaten meals, a flickering candle. But no one was there. Just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a figure, barely visible, shrouded in shadow. "Help me," it whispered, the voice sending a jolt of fear through me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged within me as I banged on the door, desperate to escape. Just then, I realized this was the same voice that had been calling for help on the radio. It wasn't a plea for rescue, it was a lure. I had been drawn into a trap, led by that faint echo of despair. My heart raced, and I could hear the voice growing louder, surrounding me, suffocating me. Just as I thought I was trapped forever, I slammed my shoulder against the door with everything I had. It burst open, and I stumbled back outside, gasping for breath. I leaped into my truck, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I sped away, the road blurring past me as I tried to shake off the horror I had just experienced. My mind raced with the chilling realization there was no one to save. Whatever I heard wasn't a cry for help, but an echo of something far darker, something that thrived on fear and despair. As I drove away, I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of that figure standing in the shadows, watching me leave. Now, I can't help but wonder, what if I had stayed just a moment longer? What if that voice wasn't a trap, but a warning? Those woods hold secrets, and I'm sure that whatever haunted those trees still lingers there, waiting for the next lost soul to wander too far off the path. And as I lie in bed at night, I hear whispers, faint but persistent, reminding me that some roads are better left untraveled. I decided to take a break from the usual grind. My name is Ethan Cherokee, and I'm a mechanic. Being part of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, my hands are often grease-stained, and my days blur into one another. So, when I finally had a day off, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed to a quiet lake in South Dakota. I figured some time by the water would help me unwind and clear my mind, but it didn't take long for my plans to unravel. The sky loomed gray, and the air was thick with humidity. It wasn't the idyllic scene I'd imagined. Still, I set up my spot, casting my line into the murky depths. As I sat there, waiting for a nibble, I couldn't shake the stress of everyday life. Thoughts of overdue bills and the noise of the city nagged at me. I reached for the radio, but the latest news about disappearances made my skin crawl. I turned it off, hoping that quiet would bring me peace, but instead, it felt like an invitation to something lurking just beyond my awareness. While fishing, I tried to focus on the lessons my father taught me. He had a way of making the simple act of fishing feel sacred. Patience, he used to say. You need to be one with the water. I recalled the calmness in his voice, how it would flow like the river itself. But as I sat there, that serenity seemed distant, like an echo fading into the fog of my worries. I gripped my fishing pole tightly, trying to ground myself in that moment, yet a prickling sensation at the back of my neck made me uneasy. Strange sounds began to drift through the air, muffled and almost rhythmic. I glanced around, half expecting to see a fellow fisherman nearby, but the shore remained deserted. The rustling in the reeds stirred something primal within me. Was it just the wind, or was there something else? I told myself it was probably nothing, just the nature surrounding me. Yet, as I turned back to the water, the scent of damp earth mingled with something else, a sharp, metallic odor that made my stomach churn. Ignoring it, I focused on my line, watching the bobber float. Suddenly, I felt a tug, a solid, determined pull that sent a rush of adrenaline through me. I fought back, reeling in what I hoped was a hefty catch. But the moment I felt it break the surface, everything changed. It wasn't just a fish, it was something more. The creature writhed, thrashing against the water, and then, in a blink, a shadow swept beneath it, pulling my catch down into the depths. Panic surged within me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. A chill shot down my spine as I instinctively stepped away from the edge, my instincts screaming at me to flee. I thought of all the stories my father told me about creatures that inhabited these waters, tales of guardians and spirits that lurked where light met darkness. I had always dismissed them as folklore, but now those tales felt too close for comfort. As I made my way back to the dock, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The stillness around me felt charged, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I arrived at the wooden platform, scanning the shoreline for any sign of the shadow that had interrupted my day. My heart thumped loudly in my chest, and my mind raced with questions. What had I just witnessed? Was it my imagination running wild? Or was there really something in the water? Just then, I spotted movement in the thick brush bordering the lake. My breath caught in my throat as a shape shifted just out of sight, something dark and elusive. For a fleeting moment, I caught a glimpse of something with eyes that seemed almost human. It was a sight that would haunt me long after I left that lake, a reminder of the boundaries between reality and the unknown. I felt a strange pull to explore, yet fear rooted me in place. Part of me wanted to flee, to distance myself from whatever was hiding there. But another part, the part that remembered my father's stories, urged me to confront it, to understand what I had stumbled upon. I stood there, torn between the familiar and the extraordinary, knowing that this was only the beginning of a journey into shadow couldn't quite comprehend. My instincts screamed at me to run, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. I stood there, heart racing, torn between the desire to flee and an inexplicable pull towards whatever hid just beyond the trees. The fading light cast long shadows across the ground, and with each passing moment, the air thickened with an unsettling tension. I reminded myself of the countless tales I'd heard, stories of guardians of the lake, but they seemed distant now, almost trivial compared to the primal fear I felt in that instant. "Ethan, this is ridiculous," I muttered under my breath, shaking my head as if that could erase the image from my mind. Yet the urge to investigate grew stronger. What if it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps an animal? I recalled how many times I had dismissed strange noises in the woods, chalking them up to deer or raccoons. But this felt different. The very fabric of reality seemed to shimmer, as if the world around me held secrets just out of reach. I slowly made my way toward the edge of the thicket, my heart pounding in my ears. As I approached, I could see more clearly. The underbrush parted slightly, revealing a small clearing where the shadows danced under the last flickers of daylight. The rhythmic sounds from earlier intensified, almost like a heartbeat echoing through the trees. I peered into the darkness, straining my eyes, but saw nothing at first, just the familiar shapes of branches and leaves. Then, a flash of movement caught my attention, a blur darting behind a tree. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound brave. My voice wavered, revealing my apprehension. No response came, just the rustling of leaves, as if the forest itself were teasing me. I stepped closer, and with each footfall, the world around me seemed to grow heavier, like it was pressing down with an unseen weight. "What are you hiding?" I whispered to myself, pushing aside a branch to peer deeper into the brush. The moment I did, a low growl reverberated through the air. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal sound. This was different. It felt almost human, distorted yet familiar. The hair on my arm stood at attention as a chill crawled up my spine. My instincts screamed that I was not alone. "Just a trick of the mind," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. I had always prided myself on being rational, grounded in reality. But as the growl deepened, transforming into an echo of laughter that danced through the trees, my heart raced. This was beyond anything I had ever encountered. I stepped back instinctively, suddenly aware of how vulnerable I felt in that moment. "You're being foolish," I told myself, but my legs didn't seem to agree. With renewed determination, I took another step into the clearing, hoping to confront whatever lurked there. That's when I saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. It stood there, barely illuminated, with eyes that seemed to glow like embers. They locked onto mine, and an inexplicable dread washed over me. The air was thick, charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. I could hardly comprehend what I was seeing. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound firm. It was a simple question, but the weight of it felt immense. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by my presence. "What do you want?" I pressed, my heart pounding against my ribcage. Instead of a response, a sinister smile crept across its face, chilling me to the bone. I fought the urge to turn and run, forcing myself to stand my ground. "You've come to see the truth," it whispered, voice as smooth as silk, yet laced with an edge that sent shivers down my spine. But truth can be a heavy burden. I took a step back, but the figure moved closer, closing the distance. The world around me faded, and the lake behind me seemed to shimmer, blurring the lines between reality and illusion. My mind raced, and I thought of all the people who had come to this very spot seeking solace, only to be met with something they couldn't comprehend. "Leave this place," I urged, but my voice wavered, betraying my fear. The figure simply smiled wider, as if to say it was too late. Panic surged through me, and I turned on my heel, sprinting back to the dock, the laughter of the figure echoing in my ears. I didn't look back, but I could feel its gaze burning into me, as if the shadows were reaching out, trying to grasp hold of my very essence. I stumbled onto the dock, breathless and shaken. What had just happened? My mind raced with confusion. My instincts screamed at me to get away from the lake, but something deeper tugged at my thoughts, beckoning me to return. I had always believed in the stories my father told, but this experience shattered my understanding of what was possible. As I clambered into my truck, adrenaline coursing through my veins, I realized that this was only the beginning. Whatever secrets the lake held were far from over. I glanced back at the water, its surface reflecting the deepening twilight, and I knew I had to uncover the truth. What lay beneath those murky depths? What awaited me on my next visit? All I could do was sit there, gripped by the lingering sense that the lake was calling my name, daring me to return. I remember standing by that old cabin, staring at the door as if it were a portal to a different time. The air felt different there, charged somehow, and for a moment, I was overwhelmed by memories. Scenes from my youth flooded back. I had come up here countless times, tracking deer and checking for poachers, but never like this. The familiar surroundings suddenly seemed foreign, twisted by an unseen force. As I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaked beneath my weight, a low, mournful sound that echoed off the walls. I ran my fingers over the dusty table where I had shared countless meals with fellow rangers. It felt wrong, like an intruder in a house that had long since closed its doors. "What are you doing here?" I muttered under my breath, feeling foolish for even asking. It was as if the cabin was a living thing, observing me, waiting for me to make a move. My heart raced, and I tried to push aside the creeping unease. I needed to focus on why I was here, to patrol and protect this land. Glancing around, my eyes fell on something on the floor, a notepad, yellowed with age. Picking it up, I found it was mine, filled with neat scrawls from years gone by. I could practically hear my younger self's voice echoing in my head, full of confidence, eager to make a difference. Yet as I flipped through the pages, my stomach twisted. Dates and observations lined the paper, but the last entry sent chills down my spine. It was from the day I had been here last, 15 years ago. I didn't remember ever writing it, yet the ink was unmistakably mine. "Impossible," I said aloud. The sound of my own voice startled me. It didn't make sense. I stepped back, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. What kind of trick was this? Had I lost track of time, or was this cabin toying with my mind? Questions spiraled through my thoughts, and I shook my head, trying to dispel the fog that was enveloping me. Suddenly, a faint sound caught my attention. It was just beyond the walls, like something moving in the underbrush. My pulse quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I called out, hoping it was just a deer or some other creature. But no answer came, only the rustling continued, growing louder, more insistent. With my heart pounding, I stepped outside, straining my ears to hear over the cacophony of nature around me. The cabin felt like a trap, the very walls conspiring against me. "Get a grip, Ben," I thought, my breath hitching. I was a trained ranger. I had faced storms and bears, yet here I was, feeling utterly exposed. As I scanned the area, something glinted in the underbrush, just for a moment. Curiosity pulled me closer, but instinct screamed to run. "Just take a look," I whispered to myself, half encouraging, half scolding. I pushed through the thick brush, branches snagging at my jacket. The world felt off-kilter, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was it just my imagination, or had I stumbled onto something hidden away for years? As I drew near, I spotted what seemed like a small, rusted object half buried in the dirt. My heart sank when I realized it was a piece of metal, a broken bumper. It was old and battered, but I recognized it all too well. The memories rushed back, vivid and overwhelming. It belonged to a vehicle I had reported as stolen over a decade ago, a truck that had gone missing without a trace. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I brushed away the dirt, revealing more fragments of metal beneath. Had someone been here recently, or was this evidence of a darker story? The weight of the moment pressed down on me, and I felt as if I had crossed an invisible line. Suddenly, a voice whispered from behind me. "You shouldn't have come back here." The words sent ice through my veins, and I spun around, heart racing. There was no one there. "Who's there?" I shouted, adrenaline surging. Silence enveloped me, thick and heavy. I could almost hear my own heartbeat echoing in the stillness. As I stood frozen, the memories of the past clawed at me, the unsolved cases and unresolved questions that lingered in my mind. I had always prided myself on being a protector, but now I felt like a fool, stumbling into the depths of something I couldn't comprehend. "You're just being paranoid," I told myself, but deep down, I knew the truth. I was in over my head, and I had no idea what was waiting for me next. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Each time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see a shadowy figure lurking in the back seat. I turned the radio on and off, searching for anything to distract me from the encroaching unease. It was around 2 in the morning when I hit a stretch of road that felt different. The lights from my truck illuminated the asphalt ahead, revealing strange, dark shapes at the periphery. I couldn't tell if they were trees or something more sinister. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up, hoping for a message from my girlfriend, but it was just a notification. I tossed the device back down and continued to drive. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. "Help! I'm trapped. Please." The voice was frantic, chilling me to my core. I slammed on the brakes, nearly fishtailing on the slick road. What in the world was that? I leaned closer to the radio, my heart racing. I had to be hearing things. "Is anyone out there?" I shouted into the silence, half expecting a response. The voice returned, more insistent. "Please, I'm in a truck, near the old quarry." I felt an undeniable urge to help. Who was this? Why was he calling me? After a brief moment of internal struggle, I decided to investigate. I made a U-turn and followed the twisted road toward the quarry. I could hardly believe I was doing this. A sense of dread settled over me like a thick fog. As I navigated the winding path, I couldn't help but replay the voice in my head. It sounded real, but something about it felt off. My instincts screamed at me to turn back. Just as I thought of doing so, I caught sight of headlights in the distance, flickering through the trees. I pulled over and hopped out, straining to see through the thick underbrush. There it was, a truck, its front end crumpled against a boulder. I approached cautiously, my breath coming faster with each step. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I stepped closer, peering inside the cab. Empty. The scent of gasoline hung heavily in the air, and my heart sank. I turned to look at the ground and saw deep tire tracks leading into the woods. My pulse quickened. What kind of accident was this? Why would someone be calling for help here in the dead of night? I scanned the area, a gnawing unease creeping in as I realized I wasn't alone. Then it hit me. A chill ran through me as I recalled an old story I had heard about a truck driver who vanished in these woods years ago. He had been searching for help after crashing, but they never found him. Could this be connected? I tried to shake off the thought, but the more I pondered it, the more I felt trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The air felt thick, suffocating. I could almost hear the whispers of the past echoing around me. Suddenly, the radio crackled again. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was different this time, more sinister. My heart raced as I scrambled back to my truck. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, but the voice faded into a haunting laughter. I felt an overwhelming urge to escape, but my legs felt heavy, like they were anchored to the ground. Every instinct told me to run, yet a morbid curiosity kept me glued to the spot. In that moment, I understood. I was caught in a trap, one that had ensnared countless others before me. The forest felt alive, and it didn't want to let me go. I jumped into my truck, locking the doors as if it would shield me from whatever darkness lurked outside. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I turn back, or was I destined to be another lost soul in this God-forsaken place? I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. But before I could drive away, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. The faint outline of a figure loomed behind me, just out of sight. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My heart pounded as I glanced back at the road ahead. I had to get out of there. I slammed the gear into drive and hit the gas, kicking up gravel behind me. But as I sped away, the chilling laughter echoed in my mind, a reminder that the past was never truly buried. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I had just encountered was far from over. As I drove, the night seemed to stretch endlessly, a canvas painted in shadows and occasional flashes of dim lights from distant houses. My heart raced a little faster as the memories of that strange night came flooding back. How had I found myself on that desolate road? Each curve in the highway whispered secrets that felt both intimate and unsettling. It reminded me of those stories my grandmother used to tell, the kind that kept kids awake long after lights were out. She would sit us down and say, "Always trust your instincts, especially in the dark." It seemed like an innocent warning then, but now it hung over me like a thick fog. I still remember the faint glow from my dashboard, illuminating my hands as they tightened around the steering wheel. The voice on the radio had pulled me from my thoughts. A desperate plea crackled through the static, urgent yet haunting. "Help me, I'm trapped." It was as if the voice seeped into my very bones, shaking loose a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I glanced out my window, half expecting to see someone stranded by the roadside. Is this some kind of prank? I thought, brushing it off, but curiosity gnawed at me. As I drove further into the night, I found myself questioning every shadow. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this a trick, or was I about to witness something sinister? I had seen horror films before, where the innocent diver finds themselves in the middle of chaos, and for a brief moment, I felt like the main character of one. I could almost hear the ominous score building in the background. "You've got this," I whispered to myself, willing the unease to retreat. But the uneasiness only deepened with every mile I traveled. Suddenly, I noticed the trees lining the road seemed to thicken, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I thought about turning back, but there was something compelling me to go on. The dim light of my headlights flickered across the asphalt, revealing something glinting in the distance. My heart raced. Was it hope, or was it merely a trap? "Get it together," I murmured under my breath as I shifted my grip on the wheel, feeling the tension knot in my stomach. Pulling off the road, I parked beside an old truck, its paint faded and rusty. My pulse quickened as I stepped outside, the cool air wrapping around me like a shroud. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. I waited, listening. Nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. That feeling of being watched returned, this time more pronounced, crawling under my skin. It felt like being an actor in a play, waiting for the cue to deliver my next line. Only I wasn't sure who my audience was. I stepped closer to the truck, peering into the cab. No one was inside, just dust and shadows. I leaned in, glancing at the ground, and noticed the dirt was disturbed, as if someone had rushed out in a hurry. "This is ridiculous," I told myself. Yet the whispers of my instincts warned me to turn back. As I retreated to my vehicle, the voice returned to the radio, this time with a chilling clarity. "Why did you leave me?" It croaked, and my skin prickled with the realization that something wasn't right. I felt trapped, like I was being pulled into a narrative I didn't want to be a part of. Just as I was about to climb back into my truck, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I spun around, my heart pounding. In the dim light, I saw a figure, indistinct but definitely there. I blinked, trying to focus. The figure didn't move, only stood there, watching me. A chill crept up my spine, and every instinct screamed at me to get away. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. But there was no response, just a heavy stillness, like the air had thickened around me. Then, in an instant, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there. I stumbled back, nearly falling into my truck. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to escape the creeping dread. But before I could turn the ignition, the radio blared back to life. "You shouldn't have come here." The words hung in the air, ominous and foreboding. I slammed the door and drove off into the night, a mix of fear and adrenaline propelling me forward. In the following days, I tried to rationalize what I had experienced. Was it stress, fatigue, or something more sinister? Each time I drove that route again, I felt a weight settle in my chest, a reminder of that dark night. The question haunted me. Had I truly encountered something supernatural, or was it merely a figment of my imagination? Each turn in the road whispered its own story, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered a truth best left buried. Even now, as I sit here recounting it, I can't help but wonder if I'm still being watched. Those winding roads carry secrets, and sometimes the past refuses to let go. Maybe it's a lesson to be learned or a warning to heed. But as I finish telling this story, remember this. Sometimes the shadows are more than just illusions. they may hold the very essence of what we fear most. And when you hear a voice calling out for help, be wary. It might just be drawing you in deeper than you ever intended to go.